Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Well, Stan Gibson cites the influence of his football coach as one of his best educators when it comes to the area of coaching and leadership. Now, through his business Oxygen Plus Leadership, Stan promotes the idea of when leaders learn to coach, employees learn to lead. Stan, before we discuss this in greater detail, I'd like to get an insight into your own background.
Sure, Carl. I've been in the corporate world for, coming on 4 decades. I was in corporate real estate. I've worked as an entrepreneur. I've also worked in the U.S. for several Fortune 200 companies. So I've been around this block several times and enjoyed every bit of it and hopefully have a lot to share.
And it was your own experience as an athlete and by your own admission, playing for one of the worst football teams that enabled you to draw parallels within an organisational culture.
Yeah, I think everything I learned in college didn't come from a textbook, nor did it come from a class. It actually came from a coach that I played for. And again, my first year of college, we had the distinction of being one of the worst football teams in the United States. We went 1-10, won the final game of the year, which was a big deal. You don't keep your job going 1-10, so they brought in a new coach, and his name was Dr. Victory, Daryl Mudra. And one of the first things he did, which really impressed me, was he came in and just told everybody, I know very little about this game of football. And that kind of shocked us. But when he said that, he said, but I'm going to surround you with some of the best coaches you'll ever find. And he did. He brought in some young coaches that are all in the Hall of Fame now for football. They went on to do great things. But he also said something very, very interesting, Carl. He said, you know what? While they're going to be there to coach you, every one of you players in here, you're the coaches. Because I'll tell you what, when you're on the field, you're the one that knows whether you're beating the guy across from you or you're getting beat. If you can't relay that information to us, we don't know how to pivot inside the game. And when I heard that was a people-centric culture. That's something where, think about today's organizations and firms. The more they start to rely on those people that are boots on the ground, making decisions day in and day out, that's when they're able to relay that information and you're able to pivot much quicker. That hasn't been done in the past. And I think that's a new paradigm going forward.
And is it your belief that many business owners today are working in and on their businesses so much that they're actually failing to prioritize themselves personally?
Almost every client I work with. It's absolutely one of the areas. And I can just tell you, once we get down into kind of the weeds, they all realize that they're working in the business. There's so much stress. There's so many deadlines. There's so many things to be done that, they let themselves, kind of get behind the 8 ball. One of the things I say is if you're not good at home, you're not good at work. And if you're not good at work, you're not good at home. So we have to sit down and we have to take stock of what is their life like, what's working, what's not working. And I will guarantee you that right there is probably worth 2 to 3 months of deep conversations as to what are the routines, what are the things that they need to start doing differently to make sure that they're optimal personally and professional.
So from your experience, what are the changes that these business owners need to make immediately?
Well, one of the things that we start doing, especially when working on themselves, is we start working with routines. What are the morning routines that you need to have? What are the evening routines you need to have? And when I say morning routines, Carl, I'm talking about, once you wake up, number one, just the little things. Number one, your body's dehydrated, hasn't had any fluids for the last 8 to 9 to 10 to 12 hours. So making sure that you're getting hydrated, not just with coffee, but with water, with lemon, with things that have electrolytes to get the body going. What are you doing for the first hour and a half to prep you for the rest of the day? I always say that leaders need to be a little bit selfish in order to be very selfless. I take that first hour to hour and a half of my day. That's mind, body, and soul. And when you go ahead and you prepare yourself for that first hour and a half, you can then be a servant leader for the rest of the day. And then I start to work with them on evening routines because tomorrow starts today. Next week starts this week. You have to go ahead and prepare yourself. And so in the evening, I have what's called a 10-3-2-1. The 10 is no caffeine or coffee 10 hours before bedtime because it stays in your system and it does start to play with your circadian rhythm and with your sleep cycle. The next is the 3. I don't recommend, eating, drinking, having any kind of thing in your body 3 hours before bedtime. Why? Because that messes with your digestive system, and that works extra hard while you're sleeping, so you don't go into the specific cycles of sleep that you need. The 2 around that is 2 hours before bed. we start shutting down the technology in a house. That can be the TV, that can be the computer, it can be anything else. And an hour before bed is when we start reading, and we start shutting down the lights, and we start getting the melatonin, the natural melatonin, by just shutting down and telling our body that we're ready to go to bed. Those little routines right there, Carl, from a morning routine and an evening routine, I've had clients come back to me and say, it's a game changer. I am absolutely, my energy has boosted 40 to 50%. And then, of course, I go into a lot of other work with clients as far as how do we put certain routines when it relates to your nutrition, when it relates to sleep, when it relates to exercise, when it relates to intentionality around your calendar. So there's a lot of things that we work with specifically to go ahead and help leaders be the best version of themselves.
The concept of life becomes rich when death becomes certain was a statement which your friend made when battling cancer, and it has had a profound impact on yourself.
It did, Carl, because I'll tell you what, when death becomes certain, life becomes rich. And when he said that, and he said, I've got a 50-50 chance of living for 5 years, while I was distraught at hearing the news, he said, no, let me tell you about that. He said the last 3 months since I got my diagnosis, while I wish I didn't have it, he said, it's been the best thing that ever happened. He said, I'm living with more intentionality. I've had conversations with my wife we've never had before. I've taken all my kids on separate vacations and said, what do you want from Dad before he leaves this earth? I've went ahead and delegated, my CEO position to people that were actually more qualified, and I became the chairman and started taking more time off. He said, I've started living a life of intentionality, and that has been the biggest change in my life. Now, the good thing is that was about 12 years ago, and he is still with us to this day. But it's because of that intentionality that he was able to extend his life. And so that's why I started getting into all the neuroscience and all the physiological aspects of what does it take, what are the right qualities for leaders to take to be efficient and effective at work, but also to be personally at their best.
In your book, Living a Rich and Intentional Life, you enable business owners to reclaim their energy and purpose. But specifically, what hacks can you share with our listeners in this regard?
Well, I go into many things, whether it be meditation, whether it be visualization. But I even talk about things like having your own board of directors. Every organization has board of directors. They hire the best and the brightest people in every facet of the company to come in, whether it be human resources, whether it be finance. Well, why don't we as leaders, as individuals, have our own board of directors? Now, that means hiring the best and the brightest in every aspect of our life, whether that's your doctors, whether that's your finance, whether that's, accountability partners, spiritual partners, whether it's a health coach. I work with a lot of leaders to say we have to define very specifically who the mentors are in your life, who the subject matter experts are in your life, because you are an asset. You are a multi-billion-dollar asset. We can't put a price on you. So having a board of directors is extremely important. And again, once I've done that with clients, they've started to look at themselves and say, oh, I need to manage myself like I manage our organization. So doing things like that, I go into a lot of self-awareness with clients. We do a lot of finding out who you are and who you're not. We want to make sure that we put you in the best swim lane to where you're going to be the fastest of any athlete in that event. If you want to get in a different swim lane, so be it. But we want to make sure you know what swim lane is the best for you to be in. And I will tell you this, Carl, whatever those gifts are that we have, if we're not getting the right sleep, if we're under pressure, we're under stress, those very gifts become kryptonite. They become the very thing that takes us down. So having that self-awareness of when you're in the right swim lane or not is absolutely critical for a leader and for a team to understand what the team awareness looks like as well.
In your opinion, Stan, why are people-centered cultures so important?
What's worked in the past isn't going to work forward. It's a whole new environment. I mean, we've got headwinds that we've never had before. We're looking at so many different things that have changed. We can't keep leading and managing like we did before. We have to go into a people-centric culture where we invert the organizational chart, where it isn't only the people at the top. They have to be at the bottom of the organization. We have to engage the employees. We have to look for ways to coach. I'm a very big believer, Carl, in this, that Leaders, when they learn to coach, employees will learn to lead. When leaders learn to coach, employees will learn to lead. And I believe that that is one of the foundational components of being a people-centric organization. And that involves taking more time, asking questions. Oftentimes we get promoted because we're really good at what we do. But when I work with my clients, we work on how to not enable. We work on how to ask the right questions, how to have the right cadence of meeting with the people that report to you. What about the people that don't report to you? What about people within the organization? What about people that are out there, on the plant floor? How do you engage? That's what a people-centric organization does. That's when you're tied into the true results of what's going to change an organization around, Karl. I really believe that. It's got to change or companies won't be around by 2030.
And on the topic of leadership, talk to us about the distinction between asking questions versus enabling.
When you become a really good leader is when you learn how to ask various questions. And there are various questions that we work on, whether they're open-ended, whether they're environmental. But when you start off a conversation with somebody and they come to you with a problem, our first instinct is to go ahead and say, here's what you need to do, versus have you thought about how does this land on you? What would be another way of trying this? If we were to do this, what would be the repercussions? Or if I brought this to you, how would you coach me on it? When you start to ask these questions, it turns the problem back over or the challenge back over to the person that's asking. Then they start to develop a thought process around leading. They start to have a solution-based mindset as to, here's probably what I need to ask myself, because I can really kind of figure this out. It was just almost a cheap and easy way to go get the solution from somebody else. We want to train people and coach them up. And if we can't coach them up, we need to coach them out. But we have the ability to coach people up, and I will guarantee you that will save a lot of time in the future, as opposed to us it's almost like it helps our ego to know that we can answer their problem. We've got to get past that. We've got to get past that. We have to learn how to ask the right questions. I don't ask a lot of why. When you ask why something happened, you're going to get one specific word back of an answer. But what? How? Have you thought about? Things like that are very key as a leader to make sure that you're asking the right questions to not enable, but to grow the person in front of you.
Interestingly, Stan, you're an advocate for healthy conflict within a business. But how do you foster an environment where conflict is facilitated but does not cause harm to the people involved?
Well, you can't have healthy conflict without trust. And that is the first. And we need to learn to not only trust differently, but distrust differently. And so, I work with some assessments where we can help organizations try to find out what are the triggers of trust, what are the triggers of distrust. But once you have trust, you now have a foundation. Once you are able to come in and we help groups go through specific assessments to where there's self-awareness and team awareness. But when you start to sit down and you look at the person across from you, Karl, and you've been working with them for 10 years, and you're finding out things about them you never knew. Now it's starting to become personal. You're starting to see the individual, and you're starting to say, this has not been malicious. The way he or she has been acting is not malicious. It's their wiring. And when you know that, then you can start to say, well, this wasn't aimed at me, and we can start to talk about it in a way that brings healthy conflict to the table. It's no different than my wife. We've been married for 41 years, but when we went through this exercise, some of the things that I didn't realize were her gifts were coming across to me as ways that it was being disrespectful, and vice versa. Things that are my gifts, she didn't understand how I was wired. Once you know that wiring, then you can start to have healthy conversations and healthy conflict.
And Stan, finally, what are your top 3 tips for the business owners that are listening to this morning's interview? Simplify
is the first. There are ways to be very intentional about what you do. I help a lot of people with, kind of a stop, start, continue. What do we need to stop doing? What do we need to start doing? But what should we also continue to do? I think that going through and just knowing that you've got the systems in place to where you can basically take your time. And if you're working 12 hours 12-hour days, how can we shift that back and get just as much quality out of 6 to 7 hours? I think that's the first. I think the second is just being authentic. Know who you are and know who you're not. Just because we get put into a leadership role, that doesn't mean that we all now, have some authoritarian role over everybody. You've got to be authentic. You've got to trust other people. And I think the third thing is to protect your brand. Be careful in a leadership position that you never put your integrity in harm's way. It's just not worth it.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Stan Gibson from Oxygen Plus Leadership, and I would like to thank Stan for sharing his tips with us this morning.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.